So I know for like the last couple of weeks, we've been really focused on 2 Samuel. But for this week's message, we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to kind of be taking 2 steps backwards to go 1 step forward. That makes sense. So I know we've been talking a lot about David. And just to test you guys, test the congregation, I want you guys to give me some fun facts about David and his life. But yes, there's not a right answer, but there's an answer I'm looking for. So I want to see how long it might take you guys to get there. So we have a man after God's own heart. Yes. Shepherd. He was a shepherd. Absolutely. He did play the harp. Maybe, I don't know. Just 3? That's David's life in a nutshell? What? He did fight Goliath. Oh, that's a good one. What's that? He was a king. Yes, thank you. Yeah, that's very important. He was yes. That's absolutely. We can't hide the bad things in his life, so yes. He was a man after God's own heart, but also that. Anything else? Yeah, he's chosen, anointed, to be the king. He wrote a lot of psalms. He was a warrior, absolutely. Okay, get one more. We got 9. I want 10. What's that? He was a father. Okay, and I saw a hand over there. Never mind. We'll stick with 10. Awesome. Well, you guys did much better. I asked this question to my youth group a couple weeks ago, and they rattled off every single answer except the one I was looking for. But Tiffany, right in the middle, nailed the answer I'm looking for. David was Jonathan's best friend, or Jonathan was David's best friend. And so for this message, actually, we're going to be really focusing in on that relationship, more from Jonathan's perspective and how he was David's best friend. So with that in mind, I will pray. We're going to be doing a lot of reading of the Bible. But I remember when our Jonathan was sharing his message, he was like, hey, I hope you guys are okay if we read the Bible in church. So I'm hoping that's still the case. So let's pray when we'll dive into this a little bit. Father God, we thank you for today. And God, I just pray through this message that you would speak through me and that we can just learn a little bit more about your character and who you are and what you have done for us. We pray this all in your name. Amen. So, Jonathan, David's best friend. But not only David's best friend, Jonathan was also the son of Saul, who was the first king of Israel. And when David and Jonathan first meet, they kind of have, it's a little bit, well, not awkward, but I imagine it'd be weird because David had just killed Goliath and he's walking around with Goliath's head. And why doing this? And then if you read in 1 Samuel chapter 18, you'll see this. After David had finished talking with Saul, and he's holding Goliath's head, he met Jonathan, the king's son, and there was an immediate bond between them, for Jonathan loved David. From that day on, Saul kept David with him, and he wouldn't let him return home. And Jonathan made a solemn pact with David because he loved him as he loved himself. Jonathan sealed the pact by taking off his robe and giving it to David, together with his tunic, sword, bow, and belt. Right away, you see there's an immediate bond. And I really think that starts with both of David and Jonathan's faith and relationship with God. Like I said, David has Goliath's head in hand. Jonathan knows what Goliath looks like. And he's like, hey, this guy is the one who just got rid of Goliath. How could he have done this if not for the Lord helping him? And if you guys are familiar with the story of Jonathan, you know a little bit before this whole thing with Goliath happened, you'll know that Jonathan and his armor bearer had a similar feat happen where they went up to a Philistine outpost and they killed 20 Philistines. And we see that in 1 Samuel 14. Jonathan says this. Jonathan said to his young armor bearer, come, let us go over to the outpost of those uncircumcised men. Perhaps the Lord will act on our behalf. Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few. Do all that you have in mind, his armor bearer said. Go ahead, I am with you, heart and soul. Jonathan said, "Come on, then we will cross over toward them and let them see us. If they say to us, 'Wait there until we come to you,' we will stay where we are and not go to them. But if they say, 'Come up to us,' we will climb up, because that will be the sign that the Lord has given them into our hands." So both of them showed themselves to the Philistine outpost. "Look," said the Philistines, "the Hebrews are crawling out of the holes that they were hiding in." The men of the outpost shouted to Jonathan and his armor bearer, "Come up to us, and we will teach you a lesson." So Jonathan and his armor bearer Jonathan said to his armor bearer, "Climb up after me. The Lord has given them into the hand of Israel." Jonathan climbed up, using his hands and his feet, with his armor bearer right behind him. The Philistines fell before Jonathan, and his armor bearer followed and killed behind him. In that first attack, Jonathan and his armor bearer killed 20 men in an area about half an acre. So if you look at David and Jonathan, they both had very similar feats done by them, but only these feats could be done with like the help of God. And so David walks in. Like I said, he has Goliath's head. Jonathan sees this, and he is like, okay, there's something about this guy, right? Like, this guy must have some kind of faith, and I want to be close to him. And then they're instantly bonded. David has this huge faith, and Jonathan's like, I want to be around somebody like that. And Jonathan says that to David. And so what does Jonathan do? He makes a pact with David, or some versions might say a covenant. And he made this covenant or pact because right away they just bonded, and because Jonathan loved David as he loved himself. Now I might ask you, and I know some of you guys know the answer because I've been drilling this into my youth kids' heads for, I don't even know, 6 or 7 years. But do you guys know what a covenant is? Well, you guys know what a promise is, obviously, right? So imagine a promise, but it's a supercharged promise. That is like the best way that I can describe to you what a covenant is. So Jonathan made this pact, this supercharged promise with David, because why? Because he loved David as he loved himself. And please remember, keep this in the back of your minds. Jonathan is the prince, but he's not just any prince. He is the crown prince. When Saul dies, tradition holds that Jonathan will be the one to be the next king. So he has the most to lose out of everybody, I think, out of this situation, because we know earlier on that Samuel has just anointed David to be the next king of Israel. But I don't think Jonathan necessarily cared about all this, and I'm not sure if he was aware about this whole thing with David being anointed king yet. But he did have the innate ability to see David the way that God saw David. Someone with extraordinary faith, someone that wanted to please God, someone that had a heart after God's own heart, someone that wanted to live a life that would honor the Lord. And Jonathan got that. And because of all this, he was like, I want to have a relationship with him. And so because of this, they bonded. Their two souls were like just knit together. And then Jonathan seals this pact, or this supercharged covenant, in verse 4 by giving David his robe, his tunic, sword, belt, bow, and I have belt twice. Maybe he had 2 belts. I don't know. And this is a big deal, because if you guys remember when David was fighting Goliath, Saul gave David his armor to try on, and it didn't fit David, and David's like, I can't wear this, wasn't made for me. And we know that Saul was quite a large man, but David does accept this gift from Jonathan. And I just find it so weird, because David would put on the prince's robe, and if someone were to look behind David from a distance, they'd be like, oh, it's Jonathan. It's the next king of Israel. How wonderful. And it's like they were right, but they didn't know how right they were. They kind of stumbled into rightness, because yes, it is the next king of Israel, but it wasn't Jonathan. Also, I just want to point out just the beauty of this narrative already, how God can turn a potentially messy situation into a beautiful friendship, a beautiful brotherhood. I just think about if if Saul was in charge of this. And we'll read very soon, like Saul wanted Jonathan to go assassinate David and how much more messy it could have been. But thankfully, it wasn't up to Saul. And this, I believe, was a God-ordained friendship that has taken place. And I mentioned before that Jonathan saw David with the eyes that God sees him. And that reminds me, I remember when I was in Bible school, there was this song that we used to listen to, and it was called Give Me Your Eyes. And the whole premise of this song was like, Lord, give me your eyes so I can see people that the way you see them, that I can treat people the way you want me to treat them, really so I could love people the way that you love them. And right away, Jonathan had these eyes in his first meeting for David. And you know the saying, that person, he marched to the beat of his own drum. He does things his own way. I think right away, Jonathan marched to the beat of God's drum. And you'll see continually throughout his life how he just doesn't do what he's necessarily supposed to do, but he does what God wants him to do. He rejects what's expected of him and what he's supposed to do in the world's eyes, and instead God uses him in God's plan to have someone else take Jonathan's throne, and it doesn't bother Jonathan one bit. And I just think that takes such an act of humility and a life of submissiveness to the will of God. And Jonathan's life is filled with tons of examples of him being there for David and protecting him and helping David escape Saul, his father, who wants to get rid of David. We read in 1 Samuel 19, Saul now urged his servants and his son Jonathan to assassinate David. But Jonathan, because of his strong affection for David, told him what his father was planning. Tomorrow morning, he warned him, you must find a hiding place out in the fields. So right now we can see, we've been talking about like Abner and Ishbosheth, and these guys are just making political moves and counter moves, trying to gain power. And Saul can see that David is gaining momentum in this political landscape. In fact, it's being sung of Saul and David. Saul has killed his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. And this is starting to scare Saul a little bit. So he was like, well, what can I do? And Saul thinks his only play is, well, I'll get rid of him. And you know what? I'll bring in my son because, it's going to be his throne too. Surely he will have the motivation and the vigor to come after this guy and get rid of him. Saul came up with a plan for his servants to kill David, and the verse singles out Jonathan. In fact, I was trying to rack my brain as to why it singles out Jonathan. And like I said, the first reason, because it's like Saul was like, okay, I'll get Jonathan. He has the most to lose. I bet Saul thought a lot of motivation to get rid of David. But another reason I came up with is that Jonathan is singled out because of his strong affection for David, like it says. And we get this reason, and we get the reason as to why David survived this assassination attempt on his life, because Jonathan told him, hey, we're coming after you. You should go hide because this group of men is trying to assassinate you. Continuing on in verse 3, it says, I'll ask my father to go out there with me, and I'll talk to him about you. Then I'll let you know everything I can find out. The next morning, Jonathan spoke to his father about David, saying many good things about him. The king must not sin against his servant David, Jonathan said. He's never done anything to harm you. He's always helped you in any way he could. Have you forgotten about the time he risked his life to kill the Philistine giant and how the Lord brought a great victory to all of Israel as a result? You were certainly happy about it then. Why should you murder an innocent man like David? There is no reason for it at all. So Saul listened to Jonathan and vowed, as surely as the Lord lives, David will not be killed. So remember that, verse 6, he made a vow, as surely as the Lord lives, David will not be killed. And I bet Jonathan is just totally psyched about this, because afterward, Jonathan called David and told him what happened. Then he brought David to Saul, and David served in Saul's court as before. So like I said, not only does Jonathan rescue David, but then he talks to his father. He puts in a lot of legwork. He's talking David's praises up to his dad. And he's like, Dad, you shouldn't kill an innocent man. Remember all the good things he did? And when he was doing those good things, you were happy about it and brought about great victory. So why are you trying to go after this innocent man now? So he puts in all this legwork for his friend David won't get hunted by his father anymore. And I think Jonathan thinks he did it. He did it. He's like, okay, I'm done, because his father vowed, as surely as the Lord lives, David will not be killed. And Jonathan probably sigh of relief. Like, thank you, Dad. That's what I'm talking about. He runs and tells David, super excited, brings him back. Everything can be all fine and dandy with his best friend. But how long do you think this peace lasted between David and Saul? Or did it even last? No, it did not last. In fact, it lasted one verse. I don't know that time frame, but it lasted one verse long. We read in verses 9 and 10. But one day, when Saul was sitting at home with spear in hand, the tormenting spirit from the Lord suddenly came upon him. As David played his harp, which was in our fun facts about David, he did play the harp, Saul hurled his spear at David. But David dodged out of the way, and leaving the spear stuck in the wall, he fled and escaped into the night. Now let's try to look at this through Jonathan's perspective. He did all this legwork to get David back. He talks David up to his father. As far as he's concerned, everything is good. David escapes into the night. Jonathan wakes up the next morning. I'm ready to be with my best friend again. And then he finds out all this has happened. And can you imagine Jonathan? Like, are you kidding me, Dad? Like, after all this stuff that we just went through, and then you go ahead and do this? And I think Jonathan, he's very conflicted because he saw his dad Saul at his best. He saw his dad Saul when he first got anointed as king. And I fully believe at that point he was trying to do what God wanted to do when he first got anointed. But then, so Jonathan wants to think the best of his father, and that makes sense because I'm sure up to this point, Jonathan's dad Saul was probably one of the most important, influential people in his life. But then he's seeing all these stories, and I mean, he has to talk to his dad about not killing David, and he's like, "Okay, Dad, what is going on here? Like, you're not acting like the king of Israel. You're definitely not acting the way that you're supposed to be acting like." So Jonathan meets David, and they kind of come up with a plan for Jonathan to actually have it confirmed in his brain that Saul is actually out to get David. And if this is true, they come up with really an escape plan for David so he can actually live. And I don't have the chapter of this. Oh, chapter 20, I believe. We read in chapter 20. Then David fled from Naioth at Ramah. And this is a large chunk, so bear with me. And went to Jonathan and asked, "What have I done? What is my crime? How have I wronged your father that he is trying to kill me?" "Never," Jonathan replied. "You are not going to die. Look, my father doesn't do anything, great or small, without letting me know. Why would he hide this from me? It isn't so." But David took an oath and said, "Your father knows very well that I have found favor in your eyes." And he has said to himself, "Jonathan must not know this, or he will be grieved. Yet, as surely as the Lord lives and as you live, there is only one step between me and death." Jonathan said to David, "Whatever you want me to do, I'll do it." So David said, "Look, tomorrow is the new moon feast, and I'm supposed to dine with the king. But let me go and hide in the field until the evening of the day after tomorrow. If your father misses me at all, tell him David earnestly asked my permission to hurry to Bethlehem, his hometown, because an annual sacrifice is being made there for his whole clan. If he says very well, then your servant is safe. But if he loses his temper, you can be sure that he is determined to harm me. As for you, show kindness to your servant, for you have brought him into a covenant with you before the Lord. If I am guilty, then kill me yourself. Why even bother? Hand me over to your father." "Never," Jonathan said. "If I had the least inkling that my father was determined to harm you, wouldn't I tell you?" David asked, Who will tell me if your father answers you harshly?" "Come," said Jonathan, "let's go to the field." So they went there together. Then Jonathan said to David, "I swear by the Lord, the God of Israel, that I will surely sound out that my father by this date after tomorrow. If he is favorably disposed toward you, will I not send you word and let you know? But if my father intends to harm you, may the Lord deal with Jonathan, be it ever so severely, if I do not let you know and send you away in peace. May the Lord be with you as he has been with my father." So remember, like Jonathan has seen that the Lord has been with Saul. But as you can see, Saul's recent actions have proved that that's not really the case anymore. But show me your unfailing kindness like the Lord's kindness, as long as I live, so that I may not be killed. And do not, and this is very important, tuck verse 15 in the back of your brains, and do not ever cut off your kindness from my family, not even when the Lord has cut off every one of David's enemies from the face of the earth. So Jonathan made a covenant. Jonathan made a supercharged promise with the house of David, saying, May the Lord call David's enemies to account. And Jonathan had David reaffirm his oath out of love for him, because he loved him as he loved himself. So I really want to just zero in the last verses here. Jonathan once again makes a covenant with David. May the Lord call all of David's enemies into account. And at this time, even though Jonathan isn't completely convinced yet, but his dad, Saul, is an enemy of David at this time. But he still makes this covenant. He's like, I'm not sure yet, but even if it is so, may God bring all of David's enemies to account. But he also asked David for something, like I said in verse 15, which is to never cut off your kindness from my family. And that's very important to remember, especially in the weeks to come in the next couple messages, because Jonathan, he has a son, and years down the line, Jonathan's son will be totally floored by the kindness shown to him by David. Anyway, so we skip a little bit to verse 30 of chapter 20, and Jonathan quickly finds out, it's absolutely confirmed, that Saul is out to get David. They're at the feast, and it says this, Saul's anger flared up at Jonathan. He said to him, You son of a perverse and rebellious woman, don't I know that you have sided with the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of the mother who bore you? As long as the son of Jesse lives on this earth, neither you nor your kingdom will be established. Now send someone to bring him to me, for he must die. And Jonathan says, Why should he be put to death? What has he done? Jonathan asked his father. But Saul hurled his spear at him to kill him. Then Jonathan knew his father intended to kill David. And well, first off, it seems like Saul always has like a thing of spears nearby, like just like he's ready to hurl them. And I don't know if I would like being like the cupbearer or anything in Saul's court, because it's like, okay, he threw it at this magician, that's fine. But now he's throwing and hurling spears at his own son. That's like, okay, like I bet those guys are walking on eggshells, like giving him like the sheep or whatever for his meal, and not even looking at him and getting out of there real fast. So very, very scary. So even at his own son, and it took for Jonathan having a spear thrown at him to be like, oh, okay, my dad doesn't like David. He's trying to kill him because he just tried to kill me because of my relationship with him. A very, very intense situation. But once again, we find in verse 34, Jonathan's unwavering loyalty to David, because Jonathan got up in fierce anger for good reason. On the second day of the feast, he did not eat. But he didn't eat because his dad threw a spear at him. He didn't eat because he was grieved at his father's treatment of David. Like I said, he didn't eat because his dad tried to kill him. No, he was appalled because of the way his father Saul has been treating David for so long. And this might be hard for Jonathan, because it's like you said, he knew his dad when he was following God and doing so good, and I think he was probably holding on to that maybe a little bit too tightly. But then once all his suspicions was confirmed, and all that David said about his father was true. You know how sometimes boys and young men, they get compared to their fathers. Like there's Dave, he's the little Len. There's Dominic, he's a little Jeff. I wonder if Jonathan had those comparisons to Saul, or at least to Saul earlier in his reign, because like I said, God was with Saul for sure. But as time progressed, you begin to see that Jonathan is not much like his father at all. Jonathan, as we have been finding out, he is known for his deep love, his loyal friendship, and his faith as God. and his faith in God, while Saul repeatedly shows foolishness, pride, and disobedience to God. So Jonathan can look at this and say, okay, over and over again, I'm going to make the conscious decision not to be like you, Dad, because you have shown you're not someone who wants to honor God. I want to be like someone who wants to follow God. I want to be like someone who is faithful. I want to be someone who is a good friend and loyal. And I think one way Jonathan followed God, a very tangible way that Jonathan followed God in his will, was he rejected his own kingship, and he was ready and willing to proclaim David as king. We read in 1 Samuel 23, starting in verse 14, and this is when David is running away from Saul, fleeing for his life. David now stayed in the strongholds of the wilderness and in the hill country of Zeph. Saul hunted him day after day, but God didn't let Saul find him. One day near Horish, David received news that Saul was on his way to Ziph to search for him and kill him. Jonathan went to find David and encourage him to stay strong in his faith in God. Do not be afraid, Jonathan reassured them. My father will never find you. What a man of faith, huh? Like he's there for David. I find that so awesome. My father will never find you. You are going to be the king of Israel, and I will be next to you, as my father Saul is well aware. So the two of them renewed their solemn pact before the Lord. Then Jonathan returned home while David stayed at Horish. And I find it so fascinating that God prevented Saul from finding David, because we all know Saul wanted to kill David. But Jonathan, who has been a faithful friend to David through the thickest of times, like not even like through thick and thin, but through thick and thickest, he's able to find him and encourage him and readily, wholeheartedly endorse him. And I just love the verse where Jonathan says to David, you are going to be the next king of Israel, and I'll be there next to you, and my father knows this. So Jonathan acknowledges David as the next king, and he is ready, willing, and able to endorse him and be there for them when he needs it. Like David will be getting the crown, putting on his head. Jonathan is going to be the guy leading the chant, long live the king. And how I just find that so, I can't think of any more examples of someone that did that or has done that. Unfortunately, Jonathan doesn't get to see David become king because he is killed in battle against the Philistines. But what a life of humility lived by Jonathan. What a life of putting others before himself. What a life of loyalty. And I love how Jonathan's life can really be a good parallel between ours and in our obedience to and a submission to Christ. If you guys are familiar with the verse in John 3:30, that verse says, talking about Jesus, he must increase and I must decrease. He must become greater, I must become less. And Jonathan really embodies this with David. Jonathan, who had a fantastic relationship with David, who knew who God was and what he was orchestrating, didn't get in the way, didn't try to stop it, but he got on board. Okay, David's going to become the next king. I must become less. And I think about how many of us have the attitude that Jonathan had when with David, saying, Jesus, you are going to be the king of my life, not me. You got to become greater. I got to become less. No matter what I have to lose or gain or whatever, I want Jesus to be the king of my life. Can you guys just imagine waking up every morning and even saying that out loud, like, Jesus, whatever today holds, I want you to be the king of my life. And think about it. Jonathan paralleled this so perfectly. He had so much to lose, but he didn't care. He was very much in obedience and submission to God's will. But he had to give up a little bit. He rejected and lost a good relationship with his father. So it makes me wonder, what are we willing to give up to have Jesus as the king of our life? Some examples I have. Are we willing to give up our pride, our free time? Are we willing to give up a relationship? Are we willing to give up our shame, our hurt? What are we willing to give up to have Jesus be the king? Are you willing to give up all of it? Or is there something you're still holding on to? Now, normally, I would end my message right there with a prayer or something, but I have an epilogue to my sermon. Because, like I said, we're taking a couple steps backwards to look a little bit forwards. And like I said, the story of David and Jonathan doesn't end with Jonathan's death and David becoming king. We read, I believe, a couple weeks ago in 2 Samuel 4, verse 4. And it might seem like a little throwaway verse because even in like the version I read it in, it's in brackets, but it's going to turn out to be very important. Jonathan, son of Saul, had a son who was lame in both feet. He was 5 years old when the news about Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel. His nurse picked him up and fled, but as she hurried to leave, he fell and became disabled. His name was Mephibosheth. So remember that name because that's gonna come into play, I believe, in Dave's messages in the next coming weeks. But if you do get the chance, maybe read about the story of David and Mephibosheth. And I hope one of the takeaways you can also get from that is that David sought after Mephibosheth. He looked for him. He wanted to show kindness to Mephibosheth because he made that promise that covenant to Jonathan. And just like how David sought out Mephibosheth, so does Jesus long to seek you out and bring you to his family, no matter who you are and what you have done in your life.